This is how my garage looked 8 months ago.
I was about to transform it into my dream workshop, but with a unique twist.
Use as much reclaimed or recycled materials and stuff I already had around the house to build it as possible in an attempt to maintain a $2,000 budget. While I wasn't sure if I could pull that off, this was about more than money. My job and the very thing I find solace in doing, making things, has spiraled out of control without a dedicated place for it. Even worse, I began to lose passion for the very activity I loved. Creating a shop was the only solution in sight. I've been making things for as long as I can remember, but resources were often limited. That forced me to be creative with what I could find at home, in the neighbor's trash, or at flea markets.
I have to be careful with that though, because I may or may not have hoarding tendencies.
You know the old saying, one man's trash is another man's treasure? Well, I'm that guy who sees treasure in almost everything. Nearly everything. We'll just leave that there.
I love giving things a second chance, like my adopted bearded dragon.
But hoarding materials is part of how I ended up in this situation. I knew that building the shop within the reclaimed framework would be a challenge, but I had to prove to myself that years of collecting materials I'd use someday was all worth it. Before I could begin, I had to establish my goals. First was to use as many repurposed, recycled, and hand-me-down materials as possible. Second, spend less than $2,000 to create this space. A quick disclaimer, that excludes tools and things I already own that I've gathered over 25 plus years of doing this. I also have to get a handle on the organizational nightmare that's resulted from years of hoarding and working without a system. The space must be as functional as possible around the things I create. Finally, I wanted to appear fairly cohesive and aesthetically pleasing to hide the fact that it's a hand-me-down workshop. And maybe I'll tack on a bonus goal, as few trips as possible to the big orange and blue stores. In other words, good planning.
Sorry for the echo, but there's nothing in here yet. What I will say though is that I've done a lot at the foundational level already. This garage was likely the grossest room in this fixer-upper of a house, but I knew it had potential to one day become my dream workshop.
My first home was also a fixer-upper. I learned a lot with that one, especially how well paint freshens up a space. That ended up being one of the most expensive parts of this renovation. Another was the electrical. All the lights were rusting off the walls, revealing janky wiring underneath. While I can do basic things and help when possible, I know when to step aside for a professional like Vinny.
Voila.
Even though all the old stuff had to go, I did manage to gather things I could use later. Plus, I could finally sleep easy, knowing that wiring nightmare was gone. I originally planned to epoxy the floors. Mr. Budget wasn't having any of that and said I better get paint instead. Lucky for him, it would have been too cold to apply in this unheated space, so I didn't have a choice in the matter. While I'm unsure how the paint will hold up with minimal surface prep, much like the materials I'd use to build the shop, I decided that reclaiming my life was more important than the potential for chipped paint. There were leftovers anyway, so I can always touch it up as needed. This new look inspired me for the long road ahead. However, Mr. Budget wasn't feeling too hot after I spent $950 on the electrical overhaul and $410 on paint. I hadn't even done anything fun yet, and only $640 remained in the budget. Well, that was until I sorted through the old metals to take to the scrapyard. Do you hear that, Mr. B? That's the sound of cold hard cash going back into the budget. $56.32 to be exact.
Needless to say, I'm really going to have to get creative to stretch it out from here, and one of the items I've been saving that will allow me to do exactly that are these old kitchen cabinets.
These were original to the house. I don't know how long they've been idle, but I've lived here for 2 years, so at least that long. Years of inactivity left them grimy, and this is the first time I had a chance to inspect them thoroughly. To my surprise, they were in pretty great shape. In fact, at 30 plus years old, they're in even better shape than the new ones. I guess they really don't build them like they used to. To be clear, this is not my work. I had nothing to do with this kitchen. Stay focused, Mr. Budget, that's under a different project. I planned for this shop to include a few benches, one of which would be on the side for tinkering and storage. That's what these cabinets would become. My thought was that building this first would allow me to partly solve the organization issue and more effectively build everything else.
This is specimen A of what I've been dealing with. I have dozens of boxes all around the house with different things in them, like contour gauges, old saw blades, planer blades, whatever, stuff that I need, but I can't find it because it's all in different boxes or worse, just somewhere on the floor.
I don't know who said things get worse before they get better, because I don't think it could have been much worse. You may be thinking to yourself, how did this even happen? Simply put, I haven't had a designated place to work from or store things in years. While working, my shop ended up in different locations in the house, usually on the floor. I was so busy trying to maintain the business and provide for my family that I never stopped to fix the problem. It's not like I didn't try though. You'll see that I have bins everywhere from previous futile attempts to become organized. In what little spare time I have, I'd make some progress, get overwhelmed, and decide to do something else instead. That resulted in boxes all over the house with various things in them, and me not knowing where anything is. Thus, you have the elephant in the room. My wood storage needed help too because there were piles everywhere. Anyway, decent counter-ready cabinets meant I only had to make a few adjustments. I'm unsure if it's from my background as a fish keeper or trauma from past water issues, but I didn't want anything directly on the floor. Yes, that's the same garage. Poorly plumbed, well-reserved tanks used to be in here. They leaked several times and ruined many things I planned to use in this shop. Good times. Garage floors are usually uneven too, so why not reinforce the cabinets to raise and level them simultaneously? Naturally, I had scraps for that. I took the extra step to poly everything because I don't think these surfaces were previously sealed. Also, I have a vast stockpile of stains, paints, polys, and glue that I'll use throughout this renovation. If I had to buy it, you better believe Mr. Budget will let you know. Speaking of Mr. Budget, he appreciated this cost-effective solution for raising and leveling the cabinets. However, I was annoyed because I had to visit that orange store twice. I wasn't paying full attention and got carriage bolts that were too large for the T-nuts. Luckily, I could work on other things in the meantime, like creating holes for the correct bolts, removing unneeded boards and accessories, and detaching the doors to streamline the installation. I thought it might help to have some type of bench as I made this one. That didn't take too long to devolve into chaos. I was about to add the feet when I thought I should probably seal the back of these too. Anything worth doing is overdoing, right? That's what I tell myself to feel better about how I spend my time at least. Remember how I said this was a cheap solution? Well, each one cost me 92 cents to make. Dry fit. Well, that's the term at least. I didn't add glue, so I guess it was just a fit. Either I got lucky or planned things well because this was perfect. Almost as though they were made for this location. Instead of attaching them directly to the wall, I used ledger boards I bought when I swapped the bolts. Mr. Budget wasn't complaining, yet. I anticipated making adjustments throughout the process, which would have been far more difficult if I had put them directly on the wall. I also like knowing I can easily change things in the future if I want, though I doubt I ever will. However, these boards created a gap, which I had to account for with these spacers. All the prep work made installing the cabinets a breeze. You'll see that I kept measuring this gap to create an open area where I could sit and draft. More on that later. The leveling feet were super helpful to combat unevenness in the floor, but I also had to account for inconsistencies in the wall with shims. Yes, I had plenty of those lying around as well. I want to point out that this silly cabinet is way shorter than the rest. While I could have made it match by creating a larger toe kick, I had a better idea I'd implement later. As I countersank for the washers, I began to realize how much nicer it would be to have a proper workplace. This is kind of what I was used to though, and it would be a long time before I'd have ideal conditions. These needed more substantial fasteners than before. I picked up toggle bolts and washers when I got the ledger boards. Toggles are kind of tricky because they just want to spin. I like to use this mini pry bar to pull the bolt toward me to stabilize the toggle. The cabinets would overlap the conduit, so one board wasn't enough. I also used scraps to support the bottom of the uppers. Sometimes I work smart and not hard. This was one of those times. I made a jig from scraps to hold the cabinets at the perfect height. I also joined the faces. A shop in this room had just been a dream in my head until this point. Seeing it finally happen began to lift my spirit. There was even some treasure to be found. You can never have enough hardware. I was also excited about the feature I'd add in this gap where I didn't place cabinets. You'll see that this upper doesn't align with the bottom either. I did that on purpose to make room for a custom side cabinet. One of the wood piles had plywood offcuts, perfect for the side cabinet, and an add-on for the shorter one from earlier. While I had a rough idea of how it should be sized, I had to be exact because this would be an odd shape. This could work. I kept it simple with pocket holes in areas where I wanted hidden fasteners and butt joints elsewhere. If none of that made sense, maybe it does now. As for the add-on, it would just be a simple box. I had no idea what I'd use it for then. It seemed like a viable option to maximize space, and it looked great. There was a glaring error though, it wasn't wide enough. Thinking on my feet, I searched through the offcuts to fill the gap. Most were too thin, but eventually I found what I needed. I wasn't about to rebuild that for a 1/8 inch error. There was an inconsistency on top too. I like to think that mistakes are inevitable and how you move past them defines the project. Unless you're perfect, of course. I'm far from that though. Again, I found myself dreaming of a proper workbench when I went to add a rabbet for the back of the cabinets. I had to make do and clamp the thing down to keep it stable. The result was fine, I just had to get rid of the rounded corners. That all made room to nest panels, and luckily, I had plenty of pre-finished pieces from old projects. However, they weren't big enough. It would have to be a puzzle job. The seam would be hidden from view, so I wasn't worried about it. That was until I realized I forgot to put a mounting board on the front. I had to rip off a panel to fix it. I put even less effort into the panel here because it won't be visible. The repair from earlier held up well. I decided to patch the rest with wood filler, and to maintain a consistent appearance, I hid the plywood edges with veneer. It matched the cabinets well enough despite being oversized. I'm a simple man. I always find it satisfying how applying a glorified wood tape can finish something like this. I was hesitant to use it because of the budget, but I felt it was necessary to facilitate goal number 5. I think it would have been one thing to simply reuse old materials as they were, but another to reinvent them into something completely new. It also came in handy to hide my error. Other than a slight difference in size, you'd never know any different. I guess there really are no mistakes, just happy accidents. I didn't care if it matched the original stain exactly. Getting close enough would be good enough. I checked a few stains. Golden oak was similar, especially on this offcut. However, I was a little disappointed when it didn't match this well on the cabinets. That's because the test piece wasn't sanded and soaked up more. I just had to keep in mind that this will be a workshop, and though I want it to look nice and inspire creation, it doesn't need to be perfect. I sealed them with poly before adding leveling feet to the side cabinet. Seeing them in their respective locations was cool because these custom features helped further reinvent those old cabinets while making everything appear more complete.
As I was coming up with the plans for this workshop, one of the components I was dreading most were the countertops. Buying something new like butcher block would be extremely expensive, and I didn't want to spend that kind of money. I also didn't want to make that myself because it would take a lot of time and effort, and I was going through different DIY options like plywood and other things, and I really wasn't too sure what I would end up doing until a very unique opportunity presented itself.
No, not this U-Haul. It's where I was taking it. To make a long story short, I got permission to access vacated units in an office building. How it was explained to me is that when a business is done renting a unit, it's their responsibility to clear it or they won't recoup their deposit. More often than not, a lot is left behind, most of which ends up in a dumpster and then a landfill. Learning about this type of waste made me sad, but like I said, one man's trash is another man's treasure. I have to be honest though, it was an odd experience. Rooms once full of life had become liminal time capsules of a bygone era. It took me back to when I used to work in a cubicle myself. There was no shortage of excellent finds, including these fire-rated solid core doors, the solution to my countertop dilemma. When I got into this project, I really wasn't sure how I'd do it. I just started working. Having such an opportunity turn up was nothing less than an answered prayer. If I had bought everything I needed, Mr. Budget would have been livid. That said, I had to burst his bubble. Technically, none of it was free. Renting that U-Haul did a number on the reserves. At least I was able to get a friend to help. Thanks, Nate.
Yup.
Access to these materials was unprecedented, and it wasn't the only time either. I got a phone call from my friend Caleb a few days later. He told me, "Dude, I'm cleaning out my old storage unit. Do you want anything from it?" I immediately dropped what I was doing to help him out and collected what I could use. The doors were pretty heavy, which had me wishing I wasn't doing this alone. Working solo is what I'm used to though, and that's how it would be for most of this journey. I wanted to conserve material by doing as few cuts as possible. I knew I'd need 2 doors, so there's 3 cuts right there, 2 for the depth on each side and 1 for the length. There was also the corner of the custom cabinet, making 5 total. I'd imagine this would be a good time to have a track saw, but the clamping straight edge and the good old skill saw is the best I got. While they get the job done, there is a con: poor dust collection, and by that I mean none at all. That freed up a lot of weight, making it much easier to move. That's when I collected the measurements for the second time and repeated the process. The difference was accounting for that corner. I never doubted that these would create counters, but I wasn't prepared for how good they would look. That, or I was just excited to see some progress. Either way, I had to address those raw edges and a part that I damaged. The door I had referenced was more oak-like than these, so it wasn't a perfect match, even though this is what I had originally got the veneer for. I'm not sure if you can relate, but I'm what I would consider a recovering perfectionist. I've spent too much of my life stressing over details that don't really matter, that only I see or care about. I suppose there's a time and a place for it, just not on the edge of a countertop in my workshop. It looked close enough, and I was okay with that, especially after some stain and poly. I didn't want debris collecting near this gap in the wall. A backsplash seemed like the move until I realized it wouldn't solve anything. That's when I remembered about these weather strips I had lying around. They were effortless to install and formed perfectly to the space. What I didn't realize was that the right counter was slightly thinner than the other. I had no choice but to shim it before locking it down. As for the back, it took me a while to find them in my bins, but I used L brackets. I was excited to reinstall the doors and drawers finally. As I did, my first thought was, wow, these make it look so much better. Then I began to realize how much organizational potential I just unlocked in this space alone. It all made me incredibly hopeful for what I could achieve because I'd never had anything like this in my life. I did have to modify the last door to swing in reverse though. Then and now, I still can't get over how nice these were.
It's pretty inspiring to finally see it all come together. Now I started with the workbench because I needed a place to work at and for organization. And when I'm thinking of organization, it's the feature that goes right here. It's something that I've been obsessed with ever since I was a kid.
As I gazed at this open space, all I could see was potential. Something you must know is that I love pegboards. The thought of a perfectly ordered wall of easily accessible tools just gets me right. This affinity began long ago when I saw my friend's dad's. It was immaculate. Even the tools were outlined. Now that's dedication. I got Adam to send these pictures of how it looks today nearly 27 years later. Looking good, Frank. I did make a decent one in the garage at my old house, but when we moved to this one, it just hasn't been the same since. Here's how it looks today. Shameful if you ask me. I had to redeem myself and use it to make a new one. Plus, I already had most of the materials I'd need. The space where it would go was kind of a weird shape, and I only had one full-size board. Needless to say, I was extremely meticulous about each and every measurement before ever taking a saw to it. Now, this I could work with. It just looked right, don't you think? I even had a trick up my sleeve to take it to the next level. Chalkboard paint. I love the idea of outlining the tools as a way to keep me accountable to the new words I'm trying to live by. Put things away, not down. I also know things will change as I acquire new tools, old ones break, and so on. Theoretically, the paint will allow for flexibility in that regard. However, Mr. B didn't appreciate this kind of expense on an aesthetic adjustment. We just don't see eye to eye because I knew the paint would be worth every penny. I didn't want the ledger board to stand out behind this, so I painted that too. The pegboard needed more contact, and luckily the scraps from the cabinets were up for the task. I turned them into spacers that I attached to the sides of the cabinet, the counter, and anywhere I thought they were needed. I also made a C-shaped piece to cover this gap and provide support. That wasn't all. I also found pegboards in an office that I could use to cover the cabinets. These needed spacers as well, both for support and to give it a more finished appearance. All of this turned out better than I expected, and while I was eager to put tools on it, I had to take a detour to address the mess. My tools were somewhere in here, I just had to find them. Something I had lying around that I knew would come in handy were these drawer bins. I already had the black one, and the others came with the house. I'd been saving them for this, and even tried using them during previous attempts to get organized. To caution you for what you'll see when I go to fill these, I keep nearly every fastener I come across. I swear you can never have enough of them, and even those obscure one-off screws eventually find a home. All that's to say I have more than a few, and I hope these would help. I didn't want them to move around when I get stuff, so I mounted them to the wall.
Now you may have noticed that I'm missing some drawers on these, and I actually have no idea where they are. If I had to guess though, they're probably in a box or somewhere on the floor. There are other features I'd like to add to the workbench, but I think it's about time that I start addressing that elephant in the room.
Using random locations as a workbench is the antithesis of put things away, not down, especially when they didn't have a home to begin with. That still hadn't changed, so a new elephant was forming in real time. Now imagine that compounding over years. The inevitable conclusion is what you saw before. I knew simply building a shop wasn't going to stop this from happening again though. I had to develop good habits and avoid bad ones like putting things in boxes.
I have no idea how many of these are scattered around the house, but if I had to guess, it's probably around 40. I'll say 37.
You may think this problem happened because I'm lazy or something, but it's probably the opposite. In fact, it's a systemic issue that's occurred mostly from working too much for too long without order. That's not the root cause though. Believe it or not, I used to be very organized when I was young. I would even clean my friend's room because I just hated the mess. I've wanted to get back to that for a long time.
So that was probably just a couple seconds of footage for all of you, but it took me pretty much the whole day to find all of them. And in total here, I got 33. So I wasn't too far off, but got quite a lot here to organize. And this isn't even all the stuff that needs to end up in here or elsewhere in the shop. This is just things that were in a random box somewhere else in the house. And yeah, here we are.
I still hate mess as much as I did back then. It's just been a journey to eliminate it. To be a bit vulnerable, things changed in my teen years when my parents separated. Instability, moving, and bad emotions brought a lot of chaos into my life, eliminating any structure and routine I once had. While that was a tough time in my life, I'm actually grateful for it. It shaped my character, built resilience in me that I doubt I'd have otherwise, and led to a faith in God that transformed my life for the better. Many things were reclaimed from that point on, including my family, but regaining structure through routine has taken much longer. Getting organized is a significant component of that. And I didn't intend for this to be a therapy session. Cleaning things just had me feeling introspective. Anyway, despite what you see, I've always strived for perfect organization, which is a mindset that overwhelmed me in the past. I wasn't going to allow for that again.
So this might not look a whole lot different, but things are starting to make a lot of sense to me. I have all of the things that need to go on the pegboard here. Miscellaneous tools that can't hang, fasteners, paints and stains, loose screws and things like that, and just a rough organization of stuff so that I can better put it into other bins, these drawers and things over here, and we can really get some organization going on here.
What I had done so far took hours, and that was the easy part. Things would have to get more detailed from here. My biggest challenge was deciding how granular I had to go to remain organized. I have a lot of random items, and while high-level organization would be easier to maintain, there comes a point it would become redundant. Seeing the drawers fill up with screws and other items was inspiring. I was making actual progress this time, and what often stressed me out in the past felt cathartic, especially once I pulled out my trusty label maker. Whatever pace I had halted to a crawl when I got to the loose fasteners. There were thousands of individual pieces that I had to sort by various characteristics like type and length. My efforts paid off though, because most of the loose fasteners now had homes. I'd sort through the packaged items later and put boxed items in a drawer, though I'd later move them as things unfolded. The same went for these storage bins which I used for larger items. I put them in the lower cabinets temporarily. I ended up with an entire box of spray paint, which was my cue to start relocating things from the other room. It was incredibly satisfying to see, and this drawer held so much that I was even able to use the second for other items. It would be a long time before I'd complete goal number 3, but the burden was lifting, and I found many of my tools so I could return to the pegboard. I had to determine which tools I used most often, what made sense to hang on the board, and what should be stored elsewhere. I already had the pegs, so it was just a matter of discovering the optimal layout. This is right up my alley because I've always loved puzzles. While considering old arrangements helped me get started, the challenge was integrating those into a different board with other tools. I even modified a few things to hang more cleanly. For example, I wanted to keep my speed squares together, but the smaller one hung at an awkward angle. I determined where the hole should be and made a new one. I know many aren't fans of pegboards and prefer other solutions. I get it, numerous alternatives are likely more effective and could be cheaper. Even if this isn't the most efficient thing around, I had to do it for me. I like them and genuinely have had a good time using them. My goal with this shop was to strike a balance between functionality and aesthetics as expressed with goals 4 and 5. It has to be a space that supports what I do while inspiring me to create. Simply put, pegboards inspire me. That's why I want them in the shop. And you can't tell me they don't look good. There's just something about a clean, organized pegboard that feels right. There was more I had to do to it, but I wanted to see how it would serve me during this remodel before committing to the layout. I kept a mug full of writing utensils at my old bench, and I wanted to do the same here. The thing about hoarding is that you keep a lot of stuff you're never going to use and will likely never think about again if you get rid of them. I knew there were plenty of duds in here, so I took the time to see what worked and purged the ones that don't. One thing I wasn't happy with was the lighting. I felt that the space could really benefit from under cabinet lighting, not just for visibility, but also for aesthetics. I've experimented with a lot of different lights for my nature designs, so I had a few options in storage. I had to make minor modifications to the cabinets for them to work though. I also got to use the newly organized drawers for the first time. Knowing exactly where the items I needed were was incredible. I was able to focus entirely on the task at hand without having to dig through clutter.
Voila! Man, just didn't it the same.
I had initially built this cabinet for clamps, but I didn't check to see if the larger ones could fit, and they didn't. Many of the larger items didn't fit on the board either, which forced me to start building elsewhere. I wanted them relatively close by, and this seemed like a good location. I even took this opportunity to add another pegboard. That said, it still wouldn't solve the clamp problem. I needed a different solution. That's when I got to work processing boards, most of which were already painted. I thought it would look best if everything matched the wall, including the board itself. My solution for the clamps was a sort of cleat wall. It turned out, but I ended up overbuilding it and would do things differently now. I wanted something modular because it's inevitable that my clamp collection will grow. Having a decent workspace to build it on made a big difference too. These ended up being pretty thick, which meant I had to countersink the holes for the bolts to grab properly. I decided to install the pegboard first using standard plugs. I probably should have mentioned that I already had an abundance of these that I was able to use throughout the build. The T-square is the biggest item, so I used that to determine where the cleats should begin. I made 3 of these, but only ended up installing 1. It held more than I expected. On the other hand, I had to take another trip to the orange store for more pegboard hangers. I still hadn't made the clamp holder. Plywood scraps were perfect for this. These would hold 2x4s that the clamps rest on. Now I probably went a little overboard here, but I secured them with these massive structural screws. Clamps can get heavy, and I didn't want anything falling. I also reinforced the rest with screws. The hangers clipped right onto the wall, and just to be safe, I screwed them in. Finally, having a home for these clamps felt great. I wouldn't hang all of them until later though. For now, I had to clean up the area to build some assembly tables. The office finds came in handy yet again because these file cabinets were perfect for storage. At first, I thought about placing something between them, but having them side by side looked better. I also wanted them to line up with the tables I was about to build. Like everything else, I didn't want them directly on the floor. I had a bunch of casters that I installed with self-drilling screws. These made the cabinets look a lot more like tool chests. I later realized that these had built-in leveling feet, so I didn't need to do this. I like the wheels for mobility though, and I'm sure I could use the feet in the future for something else. Moving the cabinets became a breeze, although I shouldn't really have to do that much, so I anchored them to the wall. Now that ain't going nowhere. I placed my toolbox on top of it for the time being and filled the rest. When I got them, I didn't realize they had these folder dividers, which ended up being the perfect solution for organizing various tools, whether in drawers or on top. I also began filling the bench drawers with various items. This wasn't my long-term solution though. I simply wanted to clear the bins and group the items together for easy access. There was a large item I salvaged from an office that had to move: lockers. The only catch, they weren't in one piece and needed to be repaired. Another trip to the orange store was in order to get the materials to fix it. I don't know if you think the same way that I do, but there's just something cool about having your own lockers. Needless to say, I was willing to spend whatever to get them up and running. I decided I'd mount them to the wall with lag screws, which I had, but lag shields I did not. I got those at the same time as the other items. I know we're going low, Mr. Budget, but I'm only getting started. They were also missing some legs. I had to improvise and install a board for support. I really had no idea what I'd put in these when I got them, or even at this time. I just knew they had to be a fixture in the shop, and I'd figure that out later. Having a proper place to construct things was a must. That's why I planned to build 2 dedicated assembly tables. Before I could start doing that, I had to deconstruct an old aquarium rack to get lumber. I've always found it odd how demo day is hyped up as the best part of a project. Maybe it's just me, but I'd much rather build something than tear it down. That might be because I try my best to keep things intact to reuse them later. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy a little chaos, but not when I'm trying to preserve materials. Everything here will eventually become a part of something else, but all I really needed were the 2x4s, and I ended up with quite a stash. There were a few hidden gems buried elsewhere too, I just had to dig around to find them. Once I gathered what I could, I sketched up a plan. Some of the boards had rot at the ends from water exposure. That's one of the reasons why I install leveling feet on all my stands now, and why I wanted a similar operation in the shop. While experimenting with my tanks, a friend suggested I use leveling casters. I tried several brands, but all of them were too bulky. I kept them around because I knew I could eventually use them for something. This was their time to shine. I measured how much space they'd take up, then cut the legs from 2x6s. I made quick work of the cut list until I realized I didn't have enough wood to finish the job. Naturally, I had to make a run for more 2x4s, which took a significant chunk of the budget. I got a few other items at the same time, so I'll account for that in a moment.
I believe that the 2 main reasons why I became so disorganized was not having a proper place to store things, as well as not having a dedicated area to build stuff. I've already addressed the one, now I'm going to do the second right here.
I wanted to keep it simple because I'm stupid. I set up a guide on the bench to help with assembling the footboards. They would align everything else, so this had to be precise. It was an excellent opportunity to use old screws as well. The construction is about as straightforward as it gets. 2 frames supported by 4 legs. I made pocket holes for the interior joints, but to make using them easier, I secured the frames from the outside first. After that, I attached it to the legs and installed the middle supports. The top frame completed that side. I could have designed these to use less lumber and thus save money, but I wanted something strong that I could build quickly. However, using reclaimed materials often takes longer. For example, I had to clean up these boards to ensure the tabletop would sit flat. I also patched some holes with Bondo. Anyway, in less than an hour, I had the foundation for 2 tables. All I had to do then was add some braces for support and strength. Even though it was another expense, I knew they would look more official with a coat of paint, and I think it was money well spent, especially with goal number 5 in mind. I also managed to stretch both cans across everything I did in the shop. I was trying to be budget conscious though, and I couldn't think of a cheaper option for the shelves than OSB. What did me in was needing 11 new 2x4s. Luckily I had $10 in rewards, but that still brought the budget below $300. Mr. Budget, didn't waste any time reminding me how much I still had to do and how little cash remained. Unfortunately, I was about to incur an unplanned expense. I decided it was best not to mention that yet. On the bright side, I already had the casters and bolts I needed. With those installed, I flipped the tables over, finished painting the rest, and got to work on the shelves. This would have to be a piece together type of job because the tables aren't a standard dimension. I also had to install blocks in the corners to ensure they'd be fully supported from underneath. I couldn't help but take it a step further and painted the screws. Having the tables on casters is so helpful. Now I can easily push them aside to clean or make room for larger builds. However, they'll remain stationary most of the time, which is where the built-in leveling feet come in. Even better, thanks to those salvaged doors, I didn't have to spend any money on tabletops. I truly don't know how I would have been able to do this without the doors. If I'm going to be honest, I originally planned to set the budget at $1,000 until I saw how much the paint and electrical cost. Even after adjusting this unrealistic budget, there wasn't much left, and most sturdy options would have been out of the question. I intended to place the hinge slots near the middle to minimize cuts until I remembered the doors were angled. I had to flip them around on this one, but I didn't mind because they'll be hidden later. After checking for consistency, I set up a bit to drill the frame for screws. Sometimes it helps to get into your work. Now don't be fooled, it's not as comfortable as it looks. The seam between the doors had to go as well. I filled it with scrap spline I had left over from screen work and patched the rest with Bondo. The second table wouldn't be covered, so I cut off the hinge holes and veneered the rough edges. Like the cabinets, those small touches went a long way. However, I had to make room for the other table's secret weapon, an old carpet. This was another office find. Maybe against my better judgment, but I didn't inspect it before I brought it home. Other than a few questionable stains, it looked good enough. I removed the excess because it was a little large for what I was doing. The reason for all of this, I needed a proper glass cutting table. I do a lot of custom glasswork, cutting pieces and whatnot, and a carpet would help prevent scratches. That said, it would have to be flat to work as intended, and this was full of ripples. I tried to flatten them overnight with doors, and they helped, but not enough. I needed some carpet tape. While I wasn't totally sure if it would work, the review seemed solid, so I gave it a shot. I applied the tape and stretched the carpet as tightly as I could. It actually worked surprisingly well. I just had to go back with a copious amount of staples to secure the ends. It took a bit of finesse, but the results were worth it. There was only one thing left to do now. I knew there was a reason I wouldn't let my wife get rid of the old vacuum. I don't think I finished any project in the shop before moving to the next, including these tables. I just couldn't put this off any longer. No, not the bottle opener. I don't even drink, I just thought it'd be cool to install. Come on, Mr. B, not now, although you're probably going to need it to take the edge off after what I did next. I had a couple of old thermometers and hygrometers laying around that I thought could be useful. Remember how I mentioned that this space isn't heated? Well, that finally caught up to me. Working through the dead of winter, even layered up, became miserable. While I had most of what I needed already, I had to get conduit and the heater itself, which brought the budget well into the red zone. Sorry, B, I just couldn't go on like that.
Voila.
Thanks, Vinny. I can't understate how much this helped. I was able to complete the tables and feel my hands at the same time. I didn't want to drill into the frame underneath, so I marked everything very carefully. This led to my first trip to the Blue store where I got a steel bushing and a set of drill bits. They were on sale, which helped. Before I could use them, I found the closest sized bit to the guide on the others and pre-drilled the table. This would make it significantly easier to align the large bit, which I'd use to create dog holes. In addition to that, I made a simple bushing setup. Without it, I likely would have messed something up. First, I used a PVC coupling and the large bit to create a hole for the bushing, which has the same inner diameter as the 3/4 inch bit. All I had to do then was align the bit with the holes on the table, clamp the jig in place, and drill away. Now, based on everything I saw, I assumed it worked, but I couldn't tell for sure until I removed the paper. I was not disappointed at all. I didn't feel like getting the router, so I rounded the edges with sandpaper until I got the idea to combine it with a contractor pencil sharpener. I only added holes to half of the table, which would suffice. I can always add more later if needed. Either way, I was pleased with the result, especially with a few bench dogs and hooks. However, that sense of accomplishment was short-lived because the reality of the budget set in. It was now below $100. Even worse, I knew it was likely going to happen when I went to build the miter saw station. Before diving into that, I wanted to organize more. No space could go to waste, and this corner was the perfect spot for all the pipes I had scattered around the house. I also underestimated how many of these I had. I would have simply stacked them in the corner, but I could do better. Instead, I chopped down some trim boards, pre-drilled holes, and assembled a box. Then I added dividers to organize the pipes by size. I anchored that to the wall in the cabinet, and like that I had a simple and effective way to store them. I also had some stackable bins that fit nicely next to the file cabinets, perfect for small items like clamps, gloves, and old socks I used for staining. Even the trash can and skates found a good home here.
I finally get a heater installed, and go figure, the weather's warming up. In fact, this is probably the warmest it's been since I started building this in October. I'm not complaining though, I love the warmer weather. But as you can see, I got a total mess going on here, and that's because I just picked up some materials to build a miter saw station.
I was thankful to take another trip to the office to get these cabinets and a few other things, but the opportunity turned this garage into a mess. I was also getting really sick of rearranging things over and over again and hoped this would be one of the last times. If only I knew then what I know now. Before I could get going, I had to deal with a wire rack I wanted to relocate. Step 1. Unload everything. I'd put all of that back on later, but for now I wanted to see how it would look near the cabinets. I'm not sure if I hate the faux wood grain or if it's endearing. I'll let you be the judge because they are free and I probably shouldn't complain. Plus, they'd make an excellent foundation for the miter saw station. I moved everything else to the last free wall in the room, which revealed some promising space. The cabinets came with a counter, but I decided to use these tabletops instead. However, I noticed there wasn't enough room for the saw's track. This one wasn't long enough either. I knew I'd probably be better off using the doors, but I buried them in the back and didn't feel like getting them. That's when I made the poor decision to try to make these work. My solution was to pull the cabinets away from the wall to create more space in the back. While they came with a toe kick base, I made my own from some vintage 2x4s instead. I got these from Caleb years ago and had been saving them for a cool project. This wasn't that, but the budget was tight and I had no other options than to combine them with scraps to create a simple frame. Old 2x4s were larger than they are today, so I had to extend the newer ones with OSB. I took a quick detour after sealing it to fill the shelf. I was thankful to have another set of leveling casters too. I don't know why, but it's always a good feeling when something like this is easy to move. I got a second hint not to use these tabletops when I saw they were warped like bananas, but I was being stubborn and convinced myself they'd be fine. I clamped it down as tightly as I could before screwing it in and added shims as needed. It seemed good enough. I decided to build support in the back to extend the counter. That's when I was able to put this old door casing to use. My mobile stand has served me well for years. It's a bit rickety, fine for light work or job site use, but not ideal for anything too precise. I find some irony in the fact that I used it to build its replacement. Anyway, I made essentially the same thing as the bottom. I didn't really care how it looked. All it had to do was maintain the correct distance from the wall to extend the counter. As for the side stand, I went with 4x4s I already had to avoid dipping into the budget, though I still would have to later on. I was going to notch them, so I began by marking where I'd remove material. I used the straight edge to ensure the outer cuts were exact. Then I created a series of kerfs, followed by the satisfying task of chiseling them out. It never gets old. These notches would hold 2x4s, and thankfully I had viable scraps. Assembly was straightforward and honestly a lot of fun. I'm probably an amateur carpenter at best. I can come up with plans, measure, and put things together, but I haven't branched out much with my joinery until recently. It's been a rewarding experience that I see myself diving deeper into once the shop is up and running, maybe even taking on a hand tool side quest. I painted it to match the cabinets, which also looked better with the casters. That said, I was bummed I used the last of them because I knew I would need more later. I just couldn't have this directly on the floor with a good conscience. I knew the leveling feet would make it easier to maintain consistency over the entire top as well. After trimming this piece, it fit perfectly on the stand. I just had to mount it and seal the cut end. The wheels made it easy to set the correct distance between them using my saw for reference. However, I left enough room to accommodate a few other models I could see myself upgrading to in the future. I like to use a dull drill bit to mark the block before drilling the holes. After making those, I installed some plugs and secured these to the wall. These oak boards were part of a cubicle divider. I knew I could use them for something, I just wasn't sure what until it came time to bridge the gap. Then I calculated the saw's height and installed it as precisely as I could, although I knew it wouldn't be perfect. I think that's probably strong enough to hold a saw. Before it would do that, I had to address the top, which looked promising. Removing the saw from the old stand and bringing it over here was exciting. To continue, I added a slot in the back for dust collection and sealed it up. I locked this down before working in the saw. Like I said, I was able to get it pretty close, but I had to use a few washers to dial it in. Then I cleaned up the tools and was excited to give it a try until I did a final inspection. That's when the problems became obvious. There were a lot of inconsistencies that would have taken a long time to fix if I even could. I knew I should have trusted my gut and used the doors to begin with. Now there was no choice but to redo it. I had plenty of offcuts from the other doors, so I only had to dig out one. At least this time around I had a better idea of what I had to do. Cut down the boards, account for dust collection, veneer the edges, and finish the surfaces. The installation was way smoother this time around as well because I didn't have to fight the materials at all. That said, I did have to pivot when I added the saw. Washers weren't enough to get it level. Playing cards are kind of the standard for fine adjustments. I always feel bad wasting them, so I usually use old sandpaper instead. What I didn't account for though was the saw's bevel function. It was hitting the counter. Fortunately, the fix was simple. I taped off the corners, marked the angles, and trimmed them off by hand for accuracy. Now that's more like it. After refinishing those edges, I could retire the old stand until I need it sometime in the future. I wasn't done yet. There were more details to add. I ripped down a scrap to fill the gap behind the door. This even gave me a chance to use this station for the first time. It felt like I was finally getting in the groove with the shop, and I was excited to use it more. After installing this, I came up with the idea to put a shelf above it. I tried to use something I already had, but there's only one way to say it. It looked terrible. I figured I'd use the rest of the door scraps to make one instead. Before I'd actually assemble it, I wanted to embed T-tracks into the counter. They'd allow me to make consistent, repeatable cuts, which is kind of the whole point of building a setup like this. I think Mr. Budget could see the writing on the wall, or maybe he put it there. Either way, it was not looking good. I put tape on the surface to prevent chipping. Then I used a level to extend the saw's fence before marking where the tracks should go. Routing the grooves had me a little nervous because there was no room for error. I swapped the bit, adjusted the depth, drilled a starter hole, and set the guide. No more putting it off. I got about halfway through with no issues and decided to pause for a moment to clear the debris. I was relieved when I made it through, if only for a moment. The bit wasn't wide enough for the full track. I had to reset the guide and do a second pass on the opposite side. All I had to do then was chisel out the left side to square the end and reveal the work I'd done. It turned out pretty well, but I had to do it all over again on the other side. Probably excessive, but I decided to stain and seal these grooves. While it dried, I completed the shelf. That was just a matter of screwing it together and to the frame under the table. This was probably the most time-consuming task of the entire renovation because of the counter issues. I'm glad that happened how it did though. The T-tracks felt like a huge win and it looked good, and even though those tabletops weren't usable, they would still be a part of this. I cut one down to use as a shelf on the stand. They would also become the fences. Even though the T-track exposed how warped they truly are, they were the correct length, and fortunately there was a simple solution. I knew I could get a clean cut on the flat surfaces with the guide. Then I clamped the pieces, ensured they were square, and screwed them together. I may have been disappointed earlier, but I think these are better for the fences than anything else I would have used. All I had to do now was align them with the saw's fence and lock them down. It was a beautiful sight indeed. Watching the continual decline of the budget, however, was not. Especially after I got adhesive measuring tape. I knew built-in measurements would be a massive quality of life upgrade for quick, accurate cuts. Of course, they'd only be helpful if I installed them precisely. I've seen a few ways to do this, but here's what I did. I removed the factory edge to square off the board before measuring the distance from it and the blade, 13.5 inches. Then I clamped it down and cut. It was exactly 13.5 inches, so I marked the fence and applied the tape up to that point for a test. I cut a 12-inch piece and it aligned perfectly with this roller. Confident in its accuracy, I applied the rest and trimmed off the excess. The process on the other side was the same. I still had to do something about dust collection, and there was no room in the budget for anything fancy, so I had to get creative. I had a bunch of random plumbing pieces, including unions. What I didn't have was a vacuum, so I got one. This purchase officially depleted every last cent from the budget, sending us into the negatives. I hate to say it, Mr. Budget, but I'm about to spend even more. I am working on a plan to recoup some money. I can't do it till later though. I guess I'll just assemble my vacuum in the meantime to feel better about what I did. An issue with this setup though was that the vacuum's hose was too big. That's when I came up with this janky setup. I spaced it out with a pipe and a coupling to add a bigger union. Sometimes you just gotta work with what you have. Before doing anything else, I wanted to see if this would actually help or if it was a waste of time. While it might not look like much at first, there's a decent improvement with the vacuum attachment. However, I didn't want to have to turn this on every time, so I bought an auto switch. Whenever I run the saw, the vacuum automatically turns on for a specified duration. I also had a 90-degree extension that allowed me to run the cord better. Additionally, I clamped the hose to the side of a board to hold it in place and for cord management. I buttoned that up with a few zip ties and outlet covers.
I'm extremely pleased with how the miter saw station turned out, and while I do have some details yet to do over here, I really want to do something about this wood storage situation first. I'm tired of having it just thrown around everywhere, and I really want to get other things organized too, but before I can do that, I think I gotta do something about this.
I'm not exactly sure what these metal grids were used for, but they were about to be converted into shelves. I planned to attach them directly to the right of the miter saw station. Before I could do that, I had to add another board for support. I needed something for the other side as well. Thankfully, amongst the various wood piles, I had 2x10 offcuts and a PVC board I could use to my advantage. While I've done some extreme things thus far, simply avoiding direct contact with the concrete would be good enough. That's where the PVC came in. All I had to do was cut it to length, and it matched up perfectly. Then I cut blocks from various scraps to create support. Having proper wood storage in the shop was imperative, and while these shelves would help, they weren't my only solution. Still, it was a solid start. And after what I just went through, I kept it as simple as I could. Not only did it go together effortlessly, but I like to think my idea to secure them with coax clamps was pretty clever. That meant I could finally begin sorting wood. I've been using this barrel from the storage unit for offcuts. It accumulated plenty of usable pieces. I just had to find them. You'll see that I left the bottom a little taller for totes. These will hold items that are just too small to store elsewhere. I would also need a place for large items like sheet goods. I had been thinking about this the entire time I worked on the shop, so I had a pretty good idea of what I wanted to do. I used the rest of my 2x10s and this mangled common board to create that. I trimmed off this goofy section so I could actually use it. However, that made it a lot shorter, so I had to angle the corners on the 2x10s to compensate. This base was really nothing more than a glorified box. On its own, it wouldn't do much. It's what I'd combine with it that would make all the difference, and while I had a decent idea of what I'd store on it, I had to sort the materials again. As I did that, I realized a lot of stuff needed to come out of the garage entirely. For example, there were 2 extra filing cabinets that I didn't plan to use, cabinets I got for a bathroom, extra doors I got just in case, and a massive conference table that I'm going to use for something else. I figured I might as well take the time to complete a few random tasks as well, like detailing the miter saw station with the skirt and installing my retractable extension cord in the ceiling. There were already holes, so all I had to do was secure a board with toggles to mount it on.
Man, all this room is crazy. It's not gonna stay like that though, so I can't get too used to it. This, button that up a little bit, it'll probably be more streamlined than it is there now, but I got a workbench I'm gonna put back here that I gotta pull in from the other room.
This bench came with the house, and while I used it early on, it became a place to put things down. That's likely why I never used the pegboard behind it. Even so, that finally got put to use, and the boards, brackets, and screws that made up this frame will come in handy for other things. What I didn't realize until now was that the bench top wasn't even attached to the legs. Had I known that, I probably wouldn't have stood on it. I gotta say, it was an interesting design. A sheet of hardboard glued onto a bunch of 2x4s. It was definitely pretty old, but it held up surprisingly well, almost like a time capsule delivering boards to me in the present. The base is steel, so it would have been foolish not to reuse it. It was a bit rickety though, so I checked all the angles and tightened the bolts to stabilize it. I also trimmed the ends off the top to fit a smaller countertop. And of course, I had to save the scraps. There was some surface rust, but nothing major. I applied core seal to neutralize it before continuing. I was annoyed moving things around earlier, but even more so now. Thankfully, this was actually one of the last times I had to. It freed up room for me to complete the wood storage while giving me access to solid surface material. I originally got this to create most of the countertops. While I would use some of it for the bench, it ended up being a great option for something else. Since it's plastic, it could be used as a barrier under the wood to prevent it from wicking moisture from the concrete. The only problem was I had to piece it together, which created seams. These kind of defeated the entire point of having a barrier. Luckily, I had a bunch of flashing tape left over from other projects I was able to seal it with. I was really excited to get this moved over to the wall and finish things up. My plan at this point was to use the 2x4s from the bench as angled supports. They would divide materials, provide room for shelves, and prevent the structure from shifting under heavy loads. It looked promising, so I proceeded to install the ledger board and accounted for the angles. A variety of saws made quick work of the job. I made 2 for the sides that fit around the front and 3 for the middle. A fresh coat of paint served them well. I felt more and more relaxed with each new installment in the shop. However, there was something about this particular edition that had me feeling good. I think it's because I've had other versions of most of the things I've made already, but I've never had good storage for lumber. It's always just kind of been in piles, which isn't ideal, especially for large items. I even had a lot of awesome pieces in this garage when it got flooded from the well tanks. Unfortunately, they ended up molding and I had to get rid of them. It's a shame because I definitely would have had enough lumber to stay on budget if that didn't happen. Needless to say, it was incredible to see those piles start to disappear. I did have to tinker a bit to maximize the space, but the light at the end of the tunnel was starting to shine. Especially when I realized how well things condensed down with the smaller panels. I made a shelf from plywood and 2x4s that allowed me to fit even more. All the while, I had been making progress on the bench. I gave it a fresh coat of paint to seal it up, and cut down PVC boards that I beveled on the grinder to create feet. I couldn't let all the solid surface go to storage, so I saved the largest piece for this. I put a few of my miscellaneous tools here, such as the belt sander and scroll saw. I still had a bunch of boards that wouldn't fit in either of the spots I just made, and the best place for them was above the miter saw. Although I had a general plan using several vertical boards, I had to work out the details as I went along. Unfortunately, I had to spend more money on mounting hardware that could hold this kind of weight, which pushed the budget even further into oblivion. Sorry, Mr. Oh, I guess he quit after that last one. Shout out to Caleb. Without these random metal things from his storage unit, this wouldn't have been possible. I cut the pipes into smaller lengths, but I needed a few more. That's when I remembered about a clothes hanger rod in the pipe stash that was the same diameter. I cleaned everything up on the grinder before applying Seal. I later painted them as well. Unfortunately, I had to buy some bolts because the ones in the kit were too short. The budget just kept sinking, but at this point, I was in too deep. All I could do now was install the 2x4s. While the hole served as a countersink for the bolts, they would also hold the pipes. They fit pretty snug, but I doubt this would have sufficed. I made some blocks to place under these for support. However, I still had to address the third row. The laser really came in handy for that, and with the addition of these, it was really looking like a proper wood rack. My only concern at this point was accidentally pulling out a pipe. I had the perfect solution which I could easily implement because I had to take these out to paint the blocks. After it dried, I mixed and applied epoxy to secure the pipes permanently. The clean uniform look was satisfying, and now I could finally organize the remaining boards, getting me one step closer to reclaiming my life. That said, I still hadn't accounted for glass or plastics. I originally wanted to store those under the glass table, but it wasn't tall enough. Instead, I made essentially the same thing as I did for the sheet goods. The difference here was that I only had enough 2x10s for the sides and had to use plywood for the rest. I also ran out of solid surface and had to resort to PVC boards. I didn't want to waste them here, but again, there was no other choice. With its addition, the last significant portion of wall space was gone. I was excited to get glass on it, but before I could do that, I made another trip to the orange store to spend money that wasn't in the budget. I needed more lumber. Thankfully, they just stocked the reject cart, so it didn't hurt too badly. Anyway, I processed and installed the ledger board as before. This is where things changed. I cut some carpet to size, applied tape, and put the vacuum to work before installing it. Then I added the posts. I used the ones on the left to create shelves, each with side supports to prevent pieces from falling out. I carpeted these as well. A random material I use fairly often is egg crate. It's stored well behind the barrel. Just like the pipes and wood, I had several piles of glass. I had initially planned to store it all sideways like a bookshelf until I built this. While that may have been more efficient, it would have taken up more room, and I didn't think the trade-off was worth it. Plus, I've stored glass like this for years, and it's never really affected my work. I just have to take extra caution when locating what I need. You'll see that I had to adjust the wood storage over here. It didn't happen right away, or I would have done it then, but these shelves began sagging from the weight. That was an easy fix, but tedious to implement. I had to remove everything to install support underneath. I added more storage to the area above by assembling boards in a similar configuration to the pipes. These won't hold anything heavy, so they didn't need to be quite as robust. A pretty simple addition, but it helped a lot with smaller boards that would get lost elsewhere. Getting to this point felt so rewarding, but the list of unfinished tasks was growing, and that had to change. I figured the custom end cabinet would be most useful with adjustable shelves since the clamps didn't fit as intended. An offcut from the pegboard came in handy for drilling consistent holes for the shelf pins. I even found some shelves I could use for it when I got those wacky cabinets. While I cut them before moving the saw, I didn't finish installing them until much later. That was a mistake because seeing this unfinished cabinet silently taunt me for months was annoying. I just didn't know what I'd use it for until later on, so I let it sit. It turns out the answer had been staring me in the face for just as long because it was the perfect spot for a lot of the random things I had sitting on the bench. The miter saw station needed shelves as well. This was a happy accident because I didn't plan for this around the ones I found. They were the perfect width for this compartment. I just had to cut them to length and use the pegboard trick for the holes to install them. I didn't know what I'd store on these either. I'd figure that out shortly, but in the meantime I decided to cut down the old pegboard frame to make a new one. Unfortunately, I'd have to piece this one together, but I thought it would be less apparent if I covered it with the rest of the chalkboard paint. Even though working around the conduit and outlet was tricky, it was well worth the effort. This addition made it look more official and gave me a spot to put an assortment of random things I don't want on the main board. Oh yeah, I also got a set of T-track parts to create a stop block. I kept it simple for now. I hadn't fully realized the cabinets either. I wanted to store my sandpaper in them and already had a board that was perfect for the job. I just had to transform it into a storage rack. Even though these scraps worked out well and I was able to build it quickly, I wouldn't do it like this again. This plywood is pretty thick and occupied a lot of room where sandpaper could be. In saying that, I am pleased with how it optimized this cabinet. Another shelf in the top helped as well. I found that these types of custom features are what truly took things to the next level. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to store as many things as well as I did. Truth is, I bought this thread checker long before I knew I went over budget. Either way, I'd buy it again because I was tired of not knowing what size bolts I had and not being able to organize them as a result. I also wanted a better way to store my router bits. My solution? Drill holes in a board and attach that to another. In no time at all, I had them organized and easier to access. The drill bits were in a similar state. I stored what I could in these bins. As for the larger ones, I combined L brackets and dowels to create this thing. Kinda weird, but it works well. I figured these cabinets would be more usable with an additional shelf. I had a pre-finished board that was perfect for the task, I just had to cut it to length. I also made a few support boards that I installed directly to the cabinet. Adding the shelf was a little bit annoying because of how large it is, but it made a huge difference. This became the new home for the boxed fasteners I previously had in the drawer and random stuff like my vacuum chamber. Before Mr. B resigned, he said you can't put a price on safety and let me get these signs and a fire extinguisher on his dime. I thought they were a cool addition, but I bet he'd probably regret that now since I didn't hold up my end of the Oh, he's back. Or not? While I'm not able to keep tabs on the budget, maybe I'd have better luck with time. I figured the salvaged clock and bulletin board would come in handy. I've had Bluetooth speakers for about as long as this shop has been an idea. I was ecstatic to finally install them, even though I had to buy the mounts.
No workshop would be complete without tunes, especially when you gotta get motivated. And I need some motivation right now because I gotta build a table for the planer.
It's been a long time coming to get this onto a proper stand. All I can say is that my previous setup was a bit janky. However, remember when I mentioned about needing more casters? Well, this is what they were for. After using the other ones, I knew they were the only option for this. All I had to do then was mount the unit and make room for it on the wall where I'd store it, but not for long. While it was nice to have stuff in the bench drawers, they moved anytime I opened them, making it difficult to stay organized. This was an easy fix, I just had to find the appropriate lumber for the job. I figured some of the best stuff I could use were old cedar trim boards I salvaged from the house, which are pretty beat up and vary in thickness. They're probably few tools as equipped for both jobs than a planer. Using it with this new setup was night and day from what I used to do. After processing and cutting them down, I used them to create dividers for the drawers. While I knew these would kind of lock me into certain layouts, I knew it would be a viable long-term option. Being conscious to group like items together based on usage was key to maximizing each drawer. Simple dividers were enough for most things, but I did more for the chisels. I marked for them on a board before drilling holes and cutting notches. These would keep things neater and make it easier to care for them. In saying that, ignore the fact that I have to hone all of them. That's a task for another time. Those cedar boards also came in handy for the drafting nook. I used them to add support on the sides for other material, including trim boards on the front. I'd been saving these bamboo floorboards from the storage unit for this exact thing. I knew they'd go a long way in elevating its appearance with minimal work. I think they made it look so much better, especially after I stained the cedar. I wasn't done yet. I also decided to create small drawers under the counter. To begin, I made a small frame to attach to the front. It's crazy how even this made it all appear more intentional. This old desk hutch I had to get rid of would do the rest of the work. Well, kind of. I could reuse a lot of the components by mimicking their design. The way they worked was by sliding on this board. I was able to reuse it, I just had to attach it to another board and modify the back catch. The track was still good too. I wanted to use as many of the boards as I could to avoid cutting a bunch of dados. That's when I had a visitor.
Hello?
While I could use some of them, I had to create the others myself. The reason for them was to hold a plywood base. Everything went together well. However, I had to cut a notch for the track. And all I had to do then was move the drawer glides from the old assembly and give it a test run. Not bad at all, especially with the face boards. I knew I had the perfect knobs somewhere in my hardware stash, I just had to find them. After accounting for those, I decided to add an edge profile to match the original cabinets. After all the finishing work, I was honestly surprised at how well the cedar matched the oak. Like that, I had drawers in the drafting area. They're pretty shallow to retain legroom, so they won't hold anything significant, but I'm sure they'll be useful.
It's details like the drawers that really have me excited about completing the shop, because that's what it's all about, creating custom things. Now I still have a lot of details yet to add, but those are the things that are going to truly make the shop what it needs to be.
The first thing was taking apart the rest of the desk. I know I'll be able to use it all in time, but a few of the pieces ended up becoming part of the shop now. One of its shelves worked perfectly for a new one under the miter saw's pegboard. Since I didn't have enough board to cover it all, adding this made better use of the space. I got the idea to store my saws vertically using peg attachments as dividers. While it worked as intended, the saws kept sliding out. So I grabbed another desk board and made a little tray to keep them stable. It looked good and was way more functional than just tossing them in the drawer like I used to. I hung the coping saws too and needed somewhere for their extra blades. My solution for that was to cut a pipe that fit in a peg. Overall, the lighting was decent, but I know I'll occasionally need more, especially above this area. I didn't want to drill into the ceiling though, and decided to use some extra shelf mounts instead. I had to trim one down to fit above the light before mounting them to the block. I also used pieces from the same closet bar I used to create the wood storage area to extend the light out and get better coverage. Using it inspired me to pair it with a few clamps to make a pencil holder. While I was at it, I also moved some of the smaller canned items over to this shelf. Something that had been bugging me for quite a while was the trim around the door. I actually meant to fix that before filming anything, but one thing led to another. I also hung the fire extinguisher nearby so it's easy to grab if needed. There were a few things I still had to get off the floor, like the sawhorses. The shelf brackets were perfect for hanging them in a spot that would have otherwise gone unused due to the drain pipe. This was an excellent location for the brooms as well. I just had to pull a few hooks from the lockers and I was in business. These bins were left at the house when I moved in. I thought they'd be good on the file cabinet, though I have no idea what I'll use them for. I couldn't let the old counter from the workbench go to waste either. It'll be perfect for preserving the counters on the new bench when needed. Speaking of protecting counters, I always put down paper when I'm assembling tanks. I have a roll, but I needed a way to mount it. Luckily, I had an old paper towel bar and a pipe. I had to cut and grind that down. I also made spacer boards to put some distance between it and the glass cutting table where I'll use it most. Like that, I now had a paper dispenser. I'd been tossing plumbing pieces into a recycling bin as I worked on things, knowing there'd be a ton to sort through later. I don't really think there's a way I could have done that without getting a better look. I figured I could just put them in a few bins and call it a day. That was until I realized I had to be a little more detailed than planned. So I switched it up and cut down some egg crate to make dividers inside different bins. This gave me way more flexibility while still keeping everything organized. The best part, I only needed a single zip tie on each side to hold them in place, thanks to the indents on the bottom. I use many of the smaller specialty components in my aquariums and nature designs. Those are probably better off not being in the shop, and instead I put them in my storage area. The rest made their way into these bins under the tables, finally putting goal number 3 to rest. I still hadn't completed the pegboard either. After seeing the light above the saw, I decided to install one here. Since I had the cabinets as a platform, I could use them to my advantage. All I needed were 2 curtain rod holders. I secured them, hooked the chains to the screws, and the stage was set for what I'd do next. A very common complaint with pegboards is that the pegs pop out when a tool is removed. While I agree that's annoying because it happened to me throughout this build, there's an easy solution: peg locks. They make everything rock solid, even with heavy use. It was one step closer to fulfilling my vision, but there was one more thing. Introducing my last expense for the entire shop, and what I'd been waiting patiently to use: a chalk marker. Is it everything I've ever dreamed of? Yes. The only problem is that I forgot to outline this razor scraper. This was a defining moment, a line in the sand if you will, toward completing the project. Before I could step over that line to the other side though, there was one final detail I'd been neglecting: my old table saw. I suppose the built-in table extensions are better than nothing, but they're not ideal for fine work or larger pieces. I happily removed them to build something new. The only challenge is that I didn't want to buy wood. That said, I was in luck because I recently decommissioned another old aquarium stand. With the wood from it and what I already had, there was more than enough to get this done. I also finally got to use the last countertop. While I would have preferred to use the entire thing, the back had some water damage and was swollen. Before removing that, I cut it down into 2 manageable pieces based on the saw. That made it easier to attach the straight edge to remove the shady sections. I also cut the corners at 45 degrees to form an L shape. This might sound weird, but I knew it would be easier to build upside down, so I flipped it all and got to work. First I cut the posts and arranged them to determine the best layout. Then I created a frame around them and assembled it. I had to flip it back over to see how it would match up with the saw. I continued by adding the bottom bracing and giving it all a fresh coat of paint. What a difference that made. Like everything else, it had to be lifted. The only problem was I didn't want to use shims or buy more casters or bolts. The only option was to dip into my leveling feet stash, which I was saving for something else. I'm glad I did though, because they worked perfectly, and with their addition, the base was ready to go. I didn't feel like taking the time to fasten the counters from underneath, so I went directly through the top. I just had to be mindful of where I put them to avoid issues later. The saw looked great in its nook, especially after I leveled the feet. However, these bolts stopped it from being flush. I ran the router along that edge to fix it. Then I prepared the surface to extend the miter tracks beyond the saw. One of the first tools I'd like to replace when I'm able to is this table saw. It works fine, but I'd appreciate the safety features that come with others. I nearly severed my finger a few years ago with the hedge trimmer, and it will never be the same. I'm thankful it wasn't more serious and that I never did anything like that with this saw, though I've been hesitant to use it since. Even so, I do think having a proper table around it will help, along with my constant reminder to respect tools. However, it just didn't want to fit until I removed this arm. I also added a board on the left to keep it aligned. After that, the miter gauge worked flawlessly. The only other issue was the lock for the fence extension. The frame was blocking it, and I had to make room. Then I gave all the unfinished surfaces an obligatory coat of paint before installing the saw and giving it a test run. Other than needing a new miter gauge or a sled, it felt a lot better and worked well. I even built this stand with storage in mind. My air compressor fits perfectly in this nook. It also made a home for my vacuum, as well as a bin for the attachments. I was just about to wrap everything up when I noticed the fence didn't work anymore. There's always something. Luckily, all I had to do was create a groove with the router and paint it. Looking back, it's a relief to have this all behind me. What began as a hopeful endeavor I expected to take a month or two became something else entirely. 3/4 of a year later, and I'm feeling simultaneously elated and fatigued. This project forced me to put a lot of my life on hold, especially in recent times. I had been juggling it with other things for a while, but I couldn't do that anymore. I just had to complete it before doing anything else, even if that meant taking the longest break I've ever had from uploading on my other channel. That was stressful because it's how I make a living, though it's part of what caused the mess that hindered my work in the first place. Content creation is an interesting career path, especially when you do everything yourself. For years I balanced an office job with YouTube, working at least 16 hours a day until I finally went full time. Salvaging materials from old offices brought back memories from that time. It also reminded me that the grind never really stopped. It just looked different because I never laid a proper foundation. At first I was just doing something I enjoyed and never expected it to become my career. So once it did, I should have addressed it then. The point is that retroactively fixing a foundation is significantly more challenging than setting it right in the first place, especially this late in the process. So while my instinct has always been to work harder, I've come to realize that isn't always the way forward. Especially with this. I instead had to walk by faith and, like the trees of winter, go dormant to flourish in the coming season. As someone who spent their entire life creating things and somehow managed to turn it into a career, I genuinely don't know how I ever managed without a space like this. I've imagined it for so long, and words can't express the level of satisfaction I feel stepping into it. Being able to work without tripping on something, searching around, and easily putting things away is refreshing. I also didn't expect to have this much room to store stuff. I thought I'd have just enough, but there's so much room to expand into. Many drawers and bins are completely empty, and I didn't even get to use the lockers. All in due time. I'm sure that will change and evolve as I do, but saying it's functional around the things I create is an understatement. I couldn't be happier with how it looks either. It just feels right being in here, and unless I told you, you'd never know it was a hand-me-down shop. This made me thankful I'd saved materials for all those years, and for the opportunity to salvage what I could because it wouldn't have been possible otherwise. Plus, it paid homage to my roots, reminding me that what you already have or what you're able to find is often the best thing for the job. It's probably going to take longer to use, but the satisfaction in the end is unmatched, and you can save money. That said, maybe it's better to keep realistic budgets. Last I heard, Clarence was bowling with Vinny before traveling cross-country. I texted him about finding 26 cents in the mess and taking another trip to the scrapyard with overflow from the build, which allowed me to recoup some of the budget. I guess he wasn't impressed because he left me on red. I think I burnt that bridge. Hopefully he finds what he's looking for.
At least I was able to tame the elephant in the room. I hope it never returns. As far as his few trips to the Big Orange and Big Blue store as possible, I'll let you be the judge. I honestly went less than I expected, but I can't say if that's as few as possible or not. So 4 to 5 of the 6 goals, it's not too shabby.
What I can say is this. What may seem like a fun project was much more. Good or bad, we all lose parts of our lives along the way. It often happens little by little until things become unrecognizable. Change for the better is nice, but the human condition tends to default us for the worse. In my case, I let bad organizational practices and lack of a system get the best of me. That didn't happen overnight, so expecting to fix it quickly was a bit unrealistic. There were many times I wanted to give up or get lazy with it, but I knew it had to be done right to be something I could actually maintain. I trusted the process and ended up with the space I've dreamed of since I was young. A shop where creativity can flourish. While I know some of what I'll create here, I have no idea what the future truly holds.
For now, setting the foundation for a new chapter and reclaiming a part of my life that's been missing for a really long time feels pretty good.